am the Managing Director of the Social Investment Consultancy, doing quite a lot of work in this area. So I will start off by saying that around a year ago, I started having more discussion with fellow people of color working in the international development space, mainly from a research and evaluation perspective. And this is in the wake of Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of reckonings here in the West about decolonization and anti-racism. And so we then discussed some of the issues relating to monitoring and evaluation from this equity perspective. We discussed quite a few problems. We managed to gather around 50 people of color working in this space, mainly from US and UK, but we also had representation from different corners of the world. And what we discussed was leadership of monitoring and evaluation is predominantly very white and privilege oriented. In certain contexts, research is not reaching all people equally. It's reaching those who have the means to, say, use the internet or be able to speak English fluently. So there is also the question about reach of the research. And looking into the frameworks and processes around monitoring and evaluation, there was also the discussion that it is very funded driven and top down. And then this concept of colonialism really came up. Is there a white gaze or this sense of white saviorism that is pervasive in international development as well as within impact assessment or research functions within that? So talking about these issues, and I'm so pleased we have our panel today, which represents perspectives really from the global south, because that's really the voices that we are lacking in these conversations. But in my introduction today, I'm just wanting to frame this discussion a little bit. I was thinking as I was preparing for this panel, what was actually the starting point of impact assessment? Who were the first people who said, well, I need to conduct an evaluation. So actually, when I was doing some research in this, and here is a really good link to a research paper tracing the history of evaluation. This author found that the notion of social evaluation can actually be dated back to 2200 BC with personnel selection in China. And program evaluation-like activities were already quite evident in the 18th century, but particularly after Second World War, there has been an increase in evaluation activities, mainly with US federal governments wanting to really evaluate what kind of expenditures on the social sphere are considered cost-effective or not. And that was also quite prevalent in the UK. And so when we look at the expansion of aid and international development in the 80s and 90s, is also that donors started asserting greater pressure on program staff in the name of accountability and cost effectiveness. So I trace these starting points because you will see that particularly the last two bullet points, how we come to evaluate programs today in international development do come from the West and do have certain implications when we are starting very much with a Western request for evaluation and evidence, which is why coming back to today's discussion, can we assess impact beyond Western model? But first we need to really interrogate what we mean by Western models. For the sake of discussion today, of course, we do recognize that the West as a group is not static. They are, and is not one thing either. So within the West, there are very different manifestations. But when we talk about Western models, it usually refers to the spread of colonialism and also this very Anglo-Saxon kind of way of doing things. So to really interrogate Western centrism, I just want to offer the post-colonial feminist Gayatri Spivak, how she has been interrogating Western centrism in her work. And within colonialism or post-colonialism, where Spivak feels there is really a space of difference is cultural imperialism, and how in order for people to be taken and respected, they need to express and adopt Western ways of knowing, whether it's language, thought, reasoning. Of course, an irony of talking about today's discussion is we will be using English as a medium of language with my fellow panelists. So that in itself is actually situating our conversation in the Western ways of knowing. But then are there other ways of expressing how we know, native ways of knowing that could contradict or be different from the Western or colonial ways of knowing the world? So I think no one apart from Spivak has done more to actually contribute to this discipline around post-colonial knowledge that will very much influence our discussion today. So some of the key concepts are really decolonization, anti-racism, and intersectionality. Intersectionality noting that in Spivak's case, the subaltern, the group that she calls kind of have even less voice than the so-called oppressed, is also not one group. And she talks particularly about women from lower castes within India and how their voices are not being heard systematically. So these are some of the key concepts that I think our discussion around assessing impact beyond Western models really situate within. A more modern discussion around this is really championed by the Equitable Evaluation Initiative based in the US. I've just taken a screenshot from their website because they have talked about various concepts within evaluation that we take for granted: equity, evidence, objectivity, bias, rigor, and validity, and that they are trying to reconceive all these different notions around evaluation. So just some quick examples that I thought organizations or initiatives have actually been launched to assess impact beyond Western models. So there's the example of the Boyen Vivier Fund, which is run by an organization called Thousand Currents. It's really asking the question, can we measure and value other forms of return beyond the triple bottom line, even beyond financial, social, and environmental returns, but really looking at what fundamentally makes the world what it is. So looking at well-being and balance. And within their journey of using different kinds of measurement, they have found that it is not so much coming up with new approaches that is the issue. It's actually unlearning the habits and patterns of colonization, what we take for granted, what we have done today to get us to where we are. The unlearning is actually the really difficult bit. And within Boyen Vivier Fund, they took a lot of inspiration from indigenous knowledge. So how we see knowledge to be in the first place today has very much been influenced by our history. And for the world, the history still today is very much influenced by the hundreds of years of colonization that I think all three of us actually, our parents and ourselves have lived through on this panel. And so indigenous knowledge is actually looking at a network of knowledge, beliefs, and traditions that contextualize indigenous relationships with culture and landscape over time. And some of the things we distinguish today is not necessarily how indigenous knowledge it distinguishes. So there's just a bit more around indigenous knowledge that I think we can learn more and tap more into as we think about assessing impact beyond Western models. But apart from the question of knowledge, is also who is producing the knowledge, and asking this question as people working in evaluation and research, who and how are stakeholders involved? And there is a very good way of conceptualizing it. It's want to offer co-production ladder, which just spells out how are stakeholders involved. And we actually, a lot of times when we assess impact, coercing people to fill out our surveys at that bottom of co-production ladder, could we get to a point where we're working closely together on an equal power relationship level to be designing indicators and learning questions that matter to all of us? So I think the challenge when it comes to assessing impact beyond Western models is we need a new way of doing as well as a new way of being. But in a way, it's not new because it's tapping into what we have always done before, perhaps before we really tapping into Indigenous knowledge and experiences. So I'm really here to learn from my fellow panelists, but just offering some of those initial ideas on how we situate our debate today. But I want to therefore welcome again my panelists. So Charles Kojo van Dijk, who's head of Capacity Development Unit at the West Africa Civil Society Institute. I think Charles is joining us from Freetown today.
Yeah. Yes, from Freetown.
Great. Welcome, Charles. And we also have Dr. Arjun Trivedi, who has a PhD in physics and is also founder and executive director of Karuna Kirti Trust based in Assam, India. Welcome as well, Arjun.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. So with my really fantastic panel, I just want to ask both of you to introduce yourself a bit more, what brought you to the discussion today, and what kind of resonated with you from this topic or what I've presented so far. Charles, would you like to go ahead first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today. I think it's a very important discussion, timely. Why I think that is so, because for the longest time those of us who've been working within the sector have been asking questions about how we are actually doing impact assessment and for who we are doing impact assessment. So I'm really happy to be part of this panel. I work for the West Africa Civil Society Institute. We're based in Accra, but we do a lot of work regionally. And our focus is strengthening the civil society ecosystem in West Africa. So this topic is very important to us. I'm hoping that we go beyond the conversations. I think I'm hoping that the ideas that come from this discussion and other discussions start to influence policy and reform.
Thank you, Charles. Arjun, would you also like to start with some introductory remarks, and I'll jump into some questions?
Yes. First of all, thank you. It's really an honor for me to be here today. And this subject of the concept of decolonization is a very powerful subject, something that I've thought over deeply. And like you said, the learning and the unlearning of it is such a deep, hard work, which I've gone through. And so a lot of scholarly work I read, but ultimately I also realized something from my own experience, that a lot of people in the world have not been heard, for better or worse, for various reasons. And I decided that I'm just going to put aside whatever I know, whatever I've read, and just come here and work directly with the people, listen to them, and just begin from scratch. So I came back to the tea plantations of India where I grew up, and which I have viewed from the lens of colonization, post-colonialism, decolonization. And it's quite a thing to be here and be mentioned in the same presentation as Gayatri Spivak, because when I read her word subaltern, it felt so powerful. I'm still uncovering the depths of it, but by experience. So in that sense, we have formed a non-profit organization with the people of the tea plantation. It's It's as built from the ground up with participation of people. And I'm very much immersed in the unlearning and learning right now. And we are building this organization and doing things together.
Great, thank you so much. And I think both of you have had experience of adopting current practices around learning and evidence. So a lot of it is situated within quite Western models, whether that's log frame or more quantitative measures. So I would just like to pose this question. Do you think current practices of learning and evidence used in development sector are actually at odds with true capacity building of local organizations and local populations? Charles, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, in terms of learning, what has been the familiar traditional thinking around that has been that, it has to do with a transfer of some sort of knowledge and ideas from one place to another. And if you're looking within our development framework, if you look at the relationships between Global North and Global South, it has always been based on Global North concepts, ideas, and knowledge being transferred to the Global South. And so the whole concept of capacity building. And of course, usually there's no recognition or very little recognition of the knowledge and ideas that already exist in communities in the Global South, and very little integration of those knowledge and ideas into learning. And so what has happened is that has also then influenced the way we measure things, the way we measure success. Currently, of course, if you look at the current model, if you look at our current impact assessment models, very much Western-based, I mean, it's got a lot of scientific rigor. It's based on data and evidence, but I can argue that it's basically based on the lived experiences of actors and organizations from the Global South, usually driven by the motive for ensuring value for money, right? And that is okay because, for example, that is how that group or those group of people may understand or may account for the investments that are being made. But is that really leading to the kind of growth and development, the kind of reductions in poverty and inequality that we want to see globally? And that's a question that everybody, I think, can explore and reflect on. And I think the reason why we may be having challenges with that is that currently, what can we say are the metrics of success, and then who determines these metrics of success? To what extent do communities participate, and to what extent are their perspectives integrated in determining what success is to them? And so these are questions that we need to ask ourselves. And I believe that when we start interrogating these questions, I think what we'll have is a more contextual learning and evidence that is actually owned by communities.
Right. Yes, there's so much in what you've just said, I think you're calling for, first of all, us to reflect on who's the learning for. And, is it actually for the organizations who are receiving the funding? Is it really for the people experiencing the change? Or is it just for the donors? So that's a really important question for us to ask. And more often than not, with this Western model, it is that it's for the donors who are most often based in the West. And this assumption we have that learning and evidence is kind of a one-way thing that the Global North facilitates or create transferring to global south, but not the other way around. And I really like the vision that you're posing and encouraging us. Can we get to the point where we have more contextual learning that's owned by the community? So thank you. There's so much in there to unpack. But Arjun, just on the same theme around the current practices, if you feel that's at odds with your vision, which is very much enabling communities to make their own decisions. I think we've just lost Arjun. Well, maybe when we're waiting for Arjun to come back and join us, Charles, are there particular examples from your work across so many years where you feel actually you have done that more contextual learnings for where local communities really own the learnings as well?
Yeah,
I see that Arjun has come back, but Charles is just answering the next question, and we'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Arjun. I think the challenge has been not necessarily with the discipline of evaluation that exists right now, but it's been with the application and approach of evaluation. So let me give you an example. So we've been working a lot with community-based actors. We've been working a lot with self-help groups. We've been working a lot with informal associations, basically on issues on community-led development, community philanthropy, and domestic resource mobilization on issues of sustainability. And one of the things that we do as we are developing evaluation frameworks with these communities is to ask the basic question: what does success look like for you? How do you define success? And it's been interesting in terms of the conversations. What we hear from communities is that success for us, we are running a race, we are on a journey, and we want to make sure that we are competing against ourselves. And we want to make sure that we move according to milestones. We know you have all these fancy language like indicators, outputs, outcomes, and impact. But for us, we see it as milestones. And for us, the process is as important as the end of the journey, right? And so many communities, what they do is when you change the approach and make it inclusive, they give you a picture of what success looks like. Then they tell you from their perspective how they think they can arrive at that specific growth or development that they want to see. And then they also contribute to how they think that we can work together to get there. And I think that is how we should start looking at evaluation. And one of the things we've seen is that they always tell us, you do your evaluations and then you kind of like pack it. But evaluation should be a document that is alive. You can't do an evaluation and then you use the same framework to measure the impact 4 years later. And one joked with me last year and said, wait a minute, the evaluation 2019, is it relevant now since the pandemic came, right? I hope you've changed it because the pandemic has changed everything. And so these are some of the feedback that we've been getting from communities. They've been emphasizing on a more inclusive, more participatory approach where their voices are heard, and then they themselves own that evaluation framework and then are accountable for it and drive it. Right now, what happens is that M&E officers of INGOs and other institutions are the ones who are driving the M&E agenda, which I don't think is healthy.
Yeah, and also more often than not, donors are driving those M&E agenda and requesting organizations to submit value for money or really prove their impact rather than having this more developmental or learning mindset. So we'll come back to how we might change this model and practice in our experiences. But Arjun, I noticed there was probably a outage of electricity on your side.
Yeah.
But would you mind sharing just your views on current practices and what you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so the perspective that I have and what helps me work in this situation is it's such a rich subject. So this one perspective I have is I imagine India at independence. It's 99% agrarian and a traditional economy, way of life. And at independence, it's directly interfacing with the modern industrialized world, which knows time scales at the rate of modern computing and systems of governance. So one thing, and I have been a scientist, so I know, and I have a lot of value for science. So anyway, it was good to have both the perspectives and values for both, but I knew that coming back home, I would have to bear that pressure of people driven by so anyway, I thought I lost you again. So I, in my mind, I have to try and advocate for change, which is at the change at the time scale of a culture, for example. Here's a traditional culture which has no organic connection with modern science or industry or governance. So I have to kind of bear that pressure and resist funding which asks for impacts at that level, so that I can argue that we need to listen to the people first. What is it that they want? And honestly, we are still at that stage right now. We are really setting a precedent. It feels very new, and even people are slowly taking ownership of the vision and the mission and participating. And truly, this is a very immersive unlearning and learning experience for me, where I'm also, even I am learning, I am listening. So it's a very active, immersive process. And what turns out, it's like going to be a new discovery for me also, what we do together.
Thank you, Arjun. And I think what you said there around the pace of change, that you are really advocating for change at the pace that makes sense for your community, rather than, you know, in the context of India, it might be foreign donors, it might be simply a donor based in Mumbai who's never been to Assam and who just imagines change to happen in a certain way, and then the measurement would then follow that. So do you, I mean, what's your hope for donors who are still setting these parameters? What's your hope for them to be able to
Yeah, I think,
understand more your perspectives?
yeah, I think my hope for donors is that I hope they will listen to us, in the sense, I try to advocate, I tell the donors that, you know, we need to listen and work in the spaces of the hearts and minds of people. I mean, the very word decolonization sometimes is attached to the colonization of the mind. I cannot say enough about it. So I don't know. It's very tough, because when you live in the world of modern systems, you see everything like that, and you're professional like that, you're optimized like that. So sometimes I think we need to work hard to not just develop our analytical skills now, but our skills to be patient, empathetic, listening. And maybe that's also what I'm trying to, I don't know, in action bring out. Ask people that, okay, you know, we can program computers to nanoseconds, we can send things to Mars, but maybe we need someone to listen to us and say,
Oh, I think we lost Arjun again, but yeah, I think what he's saying is so powerful. It's about moving away from just those analytical skills that we often think impact assessment is about, but actually a lot of it is also about patience, empathy, listening, doing work with communities, which Charles, you also touch upon. Charles, would you be able to share, do you think, in my discussion, everyone kind of thinks, oh, it's the donors who are really stifling this. Do you have experience trying to influence donors on these topics? What would be your experiences or tips on that?
Yes, so I mean, this discussion, if we're going to be honest, a lot of donors have begun some of these discussions, especially foundations INGOs. They've started talking about how do they decolonize evidence and decolonize impact. These conversations are going on, but the question that is always asked is which tools are we going to? What are the new tools to replace the tools that we know? The indicators, the log frame, the way we measure. So how are you going to do it differently? And I keep on emphasizing that those tools are very valuable and valid tools. The problem is not necessarily the tools. The problem is the application, is the approach. How are we using those tools, right? And how are we integrating other or alternative ways of measuring, with the tools that are available? I mean, these tools have been based on evidence, and they've been proven to be quite effective tools within a specific context. But we need to recognize that as we are working with communities, they also have a certain knowledge and aspiration and expectation. They have a certain way they want to measure their growth. And I think that's important, because if you say you are representing these communities or working with these communities, they must have a say in what you are trying to achieve with them, right? And so, I believe that as you are engaging with these communities, you just make sure that every step of the way, I know we use the word co-creation, a lot, but I think that co-creation in the real sense, co-creation without a framework already being defined, right? Co-creation without necessarily a defined timeline, co-creation without necessarily a certain organized expectation of what the outcome should be, being comfortable with an organic outcome that you may not know, which sounds scary within the context in which we work because of just the way aid is structured and how things are reported. But I believe that if we move towards that experimental, that exploration kind of mindset, what happens is that we actually achieve more in the long term, and we build more ownership from communities, right? And I think that is what is key. Right now, when you talk to community actors or community-based organizations, M&E is an afterthought, right? M&E is an afterthought. And the reason why M&E is an afterthought, because they don't see it as a tool that enables them to make progress. They see it as another complex reporting requirement from donors. And there needs to be a shift of the way M&E is used and applied for communities to really uptake this and run with it. And so the problem is not necessarily the tools, but the problem is the understanding of the context and its application.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much, Charles. And I know some of the questions that came in about, what tools should we use? What would Global South tools actually look like if not log frames and indicators? But I think what we're saying is not about the tools. It's about how your log frames came to be designed in the first place, where your indicators co-design with the community that also speaks to their own priorities. But yeah, your feedback around participation, co-design, I think definitely that also came through in some of the comments / questions. Arjun, I would like to kind of just ask you if in your experience, do you feel donors who traditionally might ask for top-down impact assessment, are they also receptive to more bottom-up approaches?
I don't in sense because most don't have.
Sorry, Arjun, I think we still. Oh, I think we can't hear you. Would you mind switching off your camera, perhaps?
So can you?
Yeah, Arjun, are you still with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm here, but I don't think you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you now.
So I don't know if you. Okay, sorry about this. The power and the internet is unstable. But I think people who work at the top level need to be informed a little bit more about what the bottom, what the ground is, and experience is the best teacher. And often that gap between experience and what they know at the top can be big, and it takes a effort, and it will continue to take a lot of effort to truly go into the details of what like Charles was saying, to make the community participate, to co-create. What do we want to do together? How much time that takes is, let me just say, it's not easy to explain. So I think, in my experience, it's hard. It's not easy.
Yeah, and I think it is really difficult for donors, or those of us who like to have a really clear project plan, and myself included, to be able to embrace that much more organic way of doing things. But I do think there are more donors who are interested, because they see that the current way of doing things, you commission all these evaluation and you have a great report, but so what, right? And if the community hasn't embedded the learning, that in itself you could critique: is it value for money? Is it cost effective to commission that evaluation in the first place? And I've been commissioned by a donor that funds in East Africa to actually co-design the impact evaluation framework. And it took us a year to co-create that impact evaluation framework, which normally, you would just take a month for a few people to sit in the office to create that. So I do think there are examples of that happening. But Charles, there was also a question that came in, and Arjun, feel free to comment as well, that there are more and more pressure now going into this world of commercial contracts, or outcomes or payment by results, or outcomes or development impact bonds, which are common across the world, but including in the geographies that you work in. So how does this evaluation approach, this more inclusive evaluation, what we're talking about, fit into this new reality of fundraising as well?
Thanks for that, Bonnie. Like Arjun said, these are very, very good questions, but tough questions to answer. It'll be difficult for me to be prescriptive and say this works or this doesn't work. But I do have an idea, I think, for INGOs and donors. I think one of the ideas I would like to share is that, for us to get better at the approach conversation, maybe it's time we do a lot more evaluations of the evaluation process itself, right? A multi-level kind of evaluation of the evaluation process. And what do I mean? I think it's time that we start having conversations with those we fund, so the INGOs, but beyond that, what we may call the end users, to get their voices into the process itself, and what aspects of the process worked, what didn't work, and what are their suggestions of strengthening that process. I think that will help a lot, answer a lot of the questions we have in even dealing with the current funding environment in terms of development impact bonds. But whatever it is, we have to, and it's going to take a lot of thinking. It's going to be uncomfortable. We have to get out of our comfort zone. We have to find much more inclusive ways and participatory ways of coming up with the evaluation benchmarks. Because currently, what we have is not sufficient, right? We don't get uptake from communities. It's not seen as a tool that helps or promotes the development of communities. It's seen as a complexity by many communities. And frankly, it doesn't really help, because what happens is that as we do our beautiful reports and go and report back to development agencies and the ministries and say that this is what we achieved, when you go and ask communities, they have a different story. So we see that the stories are always at variance, right? And I feel that in itself is not helping to push in terms of structural and systemic change that we're looking for.
Thank you, Charles. And Arjun, would you like to come in here?
Yeah, I'll just answer this question a little bit more practically. So the development impact bonds, I began to look at it, and I mean, I will say it has promise. There's something there, but it feels too complex and sophisticated a machinery to bring down at the ground level right now. It's I think I think I think the ideas may be right, but to bring it down to the ground level, I don't think it's for an organization like us where we are still at the ground level, listening to people. Really practically, if I get into that, I think a lot of my time will just go into those processes, and I will not have the time to be
Yeah, yeah. I think Arjun, we've
to
lost
this
you.
question.
Oh,
I'm
great.
back
Yeah,
again.
I think you're
But
saying.
anyway, that's it. That's that.
Yeah, I think you're saying that for on the ground practitioners like yourself, a lot of the current M&E practices, such as development impact bonds, are probably over-engineered and take time away from you to be um, actually doing the work. And I think that
Yeah,
also helps.
yeah. I
Yeah,
think yeah. I think sometimes I feel like saying, can we just slow down these sophistications of systems and free up our energy to listen to people, get into the non-linear of the human space? I think, I mean, these things are very interesting, development impact bonds, and it's great. It shows something as human beings we can put our minds to. But I feel like let's put a stop to that. If you can use a flashlight, why do you want to use a laser beam? I mean, sometimes it's good to slow down. It's like the Vivir Fund, right? Boyne Vivir Fund. We need to put that into practice. I think we all will be happier for it.
yeah.
I believe that, but let's see.
Wow, that's really powerful. So we do need to wrap up, and I think Arjun, what you were saying, it really brings to the why we're talking about this. We're assessing real impact beyond Western models, not just because now it's the trendy topic with Black Lives Matter or decolonization discussion in the international development sector. It really brings us to the heart of why we are doing development work in the first place. And actually the voices of the communities are really what drive, I think, at least three of us in the room, and I'm sure a lot of people as well listening today. And if our ways of doing things in impact assessment can actually be going back to that original why, we will all be happier, and we won't feel like, oh, M&E is just another nuisance that we need to fill in this report. And Charles, I think you also gave really helpful feedback around evaluation of evaluation. We need more of that. And just want to see if any of you have any lasting thoughts you haven't, parting thoughts that you haven't mentioned today before we just wrap up quickly.
No, I mean, what I would like to say is I love the conversations. They're really helpful. But I want to challenge people on this call, Bond. Let's push the needle a bit. Let's try to influence policy change on the supply side. Many of us who are working the global south on the demand side are doing our best to document evidence of things, of different ways we can do M&E, and different ways we can do development. Let's work together. I believe if we work together, if it's more coordinated, we can make this change. And I like what Arjun said. Why use a laser beam when you can use a flashlight, right? So simplicity and inclusion, and most importantly, listening, not hearing. There's been a lot of hearing, listening to communities. I think that's key. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Arjun, any last thoughts from you?
No, not really, but maybe I'll end with saying that, one thing I must speak softly and gently, because when you talk about the West and the East, the colonial and the post-colonial, one thing I always want to keep in mind is these words are just for analytical clarity in the moment. Sometimes it divides people. So like Charles said, we must be together in this. So I just want to end with that, many words we use, West, East, modern, traditional. Yes, they are good for judgments in that moment, but let's not use that to break us apart and one not wanting to listening to other because either we are fearful or don't want to forgive. We need to work on a higher order powers of to be
Yeah.
compassionate, empathetic, whatever you will call them. But
Thank
that's what I
you.
want to end with.
Yeah, that's really, really great. So it comes back really down to inclusion and the bond standards of evidence, actually, which is adopted a lot by international organizations, have one on inclusion, one principle on inclusion. But I think much more needs to be brought out around this. So, and I'm so pleased to have convened both of you. And part of our challenges of doing development work indeed is not everyone has great internet connection, and we all need to be more patient and this non-linear way of conversation. That's just reality. But thank you, all of you, for being with us today. I hope you
Thank
all
you.
enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. No, it was
Yes, I did.
excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.